was Aisha bint Abu Bakr really? Outside the Muslim world, her name is often known only in the context of one controversial detail. Inside the Muslim world, she is remembered as one of the greatest scholars in Islamic history, a teacher of teachers, a source of religious knowledge for generations, and one of the most consequential women in the entire tradition. Here is the full picture. Early life. Aisha was the daughter of Abu Bakr, the Prophet's closest companion and later the first caliph. She grew up in a household at the very center of the early Muslim community, a household defined by faith, learning, and constant exposure to the revelation as it was unfolding in real time. She married the Prophet in Medina, becoming one of his wives during the final decade of his life. Classical sources give different ages for her at marriage, and this detail has become one of the most discussed and debated topics in conversations between Muslims and non Muslims. The scholarly debate on the exact age is genuine and not fully resolved, with some sources placing her considerably older at the time of consummation than the most commonly cited figure, based on cross referencing other dated events in her life. What is not disputed is that 7th century marriage customs across all cultures of that era, including Christian Europe, were entirely different from modern norms, and evaluating any historical figure requires applying the standards of their own time consistently. What's often missing from this conversation entirely is everything that came after. The 9 years she spent at the center of the Prophet's household, absorbing his teachings, his rulings, his daily practices, and his explanations of the Quran in more depth and detail than almost anyone else alive at the time. A life of learning. Aisha was known from a young age for her sharp intelligence and excellent memory. She was present for private conversations, household matters, legal rulings, and theological explanations that male companions who didn't share the same domestic access simply never witnessed. The Prophet reportedly told his companions on more than one occasion to take half of their religion from this woman, Aisha. Coming from the Prophet himself, this was an extraordinary endorsement of her authority as a source of religious knowledge, at a time and in a society where women's voices were rarely afforded this kind of formal weight. Continuing the story of Aisha, her role as a scholar and teacher, and the scale of her contribution to Islamic knowledge. The scale of her contribution. After the Prophet's death, Aisha lived for nearly 5 more decades until 678 CE. During those decades, she became one of the most important sources of hadith, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet, in all of Islamic history. Scholars estimate that over 2,200 hadiths are attributed to her, making her one of the most prolific narrators among all the companions, male or female. These aren't minor details. Many of these hadiths address core areas of Islamic practice: prayer, fasting, family life, ethics, and how the Prophet conducted himself in private, which no one else could have witnessed. She didn't just narrate, she taught. Her home in Medina became a center of learning. Major early scholars, including some of the most important legal minds of the generation after the companions, studied directly under her. She issued rulings on questions of Islamic law. She corrected companions, including senior male companions, when she believed they had misunderstood or misremembered something the Prophet had said or done. This wasn't an exception or a curiosity in early Islam. Women narrating hadith, teaching jurisprudence, and being cited as authorities was a normal part of the first generations of Islamic scholarship, a reality that often surprises people, both Muslims and non Muslims, who assume women's religious authority is a modern innovation rather than something rooted in the earliest history of the faith. Her character. Companions described Aisha as quick witted, articulate, and unafraid to ask difficult questions, including directly to the Prophet himself. The Quran itself responds to a situation involving her, the incident known as the slander, where false accusations were made against her character. A revelation came down affirming her innocence and establishing legal principles around accusations of this kind that remain part of Islamic law today, requiring multiple witnesses for such serious claims, protecting individuals from baseless slander. This episode shows something important. Aisha was not a passive figure in the background of someone else's story. Her life directly shaped portions of Islamic law and theology that Muslims still reference
The
1400 years
final
later.
part.
Aisha's role after the Prophet's death, the difficult chapters of her later life, and her overall legacy. After the Prophet's death. When the Prophet died in 632 CE, Aisha was in her 20s, and she would go on to live through the leadership of all four of the early caliphs, including her own father, Abu Bakr. Her house, adjoining the mosque in Medina, remained a hub of activity for the rest of her life. People came to her with questions about religious practice, family disputes, and points of Islamic law. She was, in effect, one of the central religious authorities of the early Muslim world for decades, not as a formal political leader, but as a teacher whose rulings carried enormous weight. The Battle of the Camel. One of the most difficult chapters of her life came during a period of political conflict within the early Muslim community, decades after the Prophet's death. Aisha became involved in a political dispute that escalated into an armed confrontation known as the Battle of the Camel, fought against Ali, the fourth caliph. This episode is genuinely difficult and is discussed honestly by Islamic historians, a moment of internal conflict among people who had all been close to the Prophet, with tragic loss of life on both sides. Aisha reportedly expressed deep regret over the events afterward. It remains a sensitive topic, particularly in Sunni Shia historical narratives, and is not something serious Islamic scholarship glosses over. Her final years. After this period, Aisha withdrew from political involvement and returned to what she had always been best known for: teaching. For the remaining years of her life, students continued to come to her, and her narrations continued to be recorded and transmitted, forming a permanent part of the foundation of Islamic law and practice. She died in 678 CE in Medina and was buried there. The legacy. When modern conversations about Aisha focus only on one detail from her youth, they miss almost the entirety of who she actually was: a scholar whose rulings shaped Islamic law, a teacher whose students became foundational legal authorities, and a source for a significant portion of everything Muslims know about how the Prophet lived his daily life. Her legacy is not a footnote. It is one of the central pillars of how Islamic knowledge has been preserved and transmitted for 14 centuries, built by a woman who spent decades of her life teaching anyone of any background who came to her door with a question, like if this gave you a fuller picture. Share with someone who has only heard her name in controversy. Subscribe, truth every day. I'm Noor. This is Islam with Noor. Thank you for listening.